My name is James Button. I'm a former journalist and public servant, and I'm chairing these webinars. The subject of tonight's webinar is sharing power, and it's hard to think of a more relevant subject to our moment. And to talk about that subject, we have a great panel. Nadine Smith is based in the UK, and Nadine leads CPI's work into the legitimacy of government. Nadine has been Chief Press Officer for the Cabinet Office in the UK, and she worked for 5 years as Founding Communications Director at the Institute for Government. Dr. Penny Hagan is Director of the Co-Design Lab in Auckland and has led work supporting teams and communities responding to challenges such as youth employment, youth mental health, chronic health conditions, and family violence. Finally, Angie Tangaere is an entrepreneur with the Southern Initiative, an organisation dedicated to innovation, in particular to place-based innovation in South Auckland. And Angie has also worked extensively in Maori health, and she and Penny work closely together. So it's going to be fascinating to get all their insights. The first, what does it mean for governments to share power? Question 2, is sharing power different from community engagement? Question 3, can we talk about some examples? Can you give some examples of governments who are practicing a shared power approach? And 4, what do you see as the most important, the most significant, most difficult barriers to sharing power? Nadine, I'm going to start with you. Tell us about examples you know of from your work in the UK and looking at the rest of the world of governments who are sharing power. And indeed, is that happening as much as you feel it should be happening?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you this evening or this morning, wherever you may be. Yeah, you're right. We've spent quite a long time at the Centre for Public Impact looking at where in the world we can take inspiration from for sharing power. I'd love to come on here and tell you there is a country that has it absolutely right. And I know that there's often a number of countries that are permanently discussed. New Zealand being one of them, which maybe we can debate later with our colleagues from New Zealand. However, you know, it's very tempting for me to sort of just give you a list of countries, but I think what I'll say is that we're seeing glimpses of hope all over the world. Many countries are just trying new things, and there's a lot to be said when it comes to sharing power, but just having that spirit, that culture of experimentation, that willingness to try and just go the extra mile to kind of work with people and find out how they want to be spoken to, listened to, how they wish to participate. And I want to just say one thing. We cannot just assume that everyone in the world wants to spend 100% of their time participating in the everyday business of government. That is absolutely not what the work of CPI has found. We went around the world and we asked people what they wanted from government when it came to sharing power, when it came to building legitimacy as well. And most people said that actually they didn't necessarily want to be involved in the minutiae of day-to-day life of government. They mainly wanted to feel as if they were just valued, as if they have a sense of belonging, as if people like them worked in government, people who they could relate to. And that feeling of self-worth and value and belonging is an essential part of the conversation about sharing power today. And there are some countries that are doing that. There also is potentially, there is also absolutely a discussion that we should have about the growth of technology and how that is contributing to the way in which government is thinking about participation and sharing power with citizens. Obviously, we can point to examples like Taiwan, where Audrey Tang has been instrumental, a young activist herself when she started, in transforming the way in which government spoke from an attitude of we know best to you know best, and really understanding how to harness the power of technology so that people could literally see what government was up to in 3 or 4 seconds of just looking at images and captures. So I think it's a really interesting place to look if you're interested in that more technology side of participation and as a form of sharing power. And then obviously there are places that have more devolved power in a more structured way. Obviously places like Sweden and Germany are examples of that. And then there are places that have actually experimented with participatory budgeting, such as they have in Brazil and in Portugal as well. And in Finland, they actually have devolved power quite a long time ago to municipalities for so that teachers could, for example, create a new curriculum. And there was the Better Reykjavik initiative as well, where they were thinking about crowdsourcing policy there as well. So I think there are lots of really good examples around the world, lots of glimpses of hope that we can look at, many enabled by technology, some through structural reform and devolution, but there is no one perfect country, James.
Nadine, thank you very much. And your example of Audrey Tang is terrific. And I think we should come back to the technology issue and how technology might be making it easier to share power as well as presenting its own challenges. Penny and Angie, I'm really interested to hear your perspective from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Tell us about, and you've worked together, haven't you, at the Auckland Council on these issues. Angie, I might start with you. Tell us about your answer to question 3, if you like, of examples that you're aware of sharing power, particularly in the current, you might speak about the current crisis that we're in at the moment in that context.
Kia ora tātou katoa, he mahi nui kia koutou katoa, ngā iwi o te motu o te ao whānui, he mahi aroha, he mahi mahana kia tātou katoa. I just want to take this opportunity to send greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, to all of the people across the world, and also especially acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture, and to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to welcome all of those that are joining us for this really important conversation. Yeah, I'm really aware that Aotearoa is often identified as an exemplar for this in terms of sharing power and control. And I just want to start by saying we are fortunate in Aotearoa to have a number of mechanisms that enable power sharing through a rights-based framework, particularly our treaty, Te Reti o Waitangi. So there are a number of examples that we can speak to where government is engaged with our tribes here in New Zealand in co-management of resources and aspirations for their people. So in that aspect, we are fortunate to have some examples about how we work as an Indigenous people in partnership with the Crown. That's not to say the implementation of that isn't problematic, and that we don't as a people continue to experience significant inequity in our communities and in our countries. But what I thought I might talk about is what we're learning in terms of our approach to sharing power and control with our communities where we're based in South Auckland, and our approach to hearing the voices of those that are most marginalised, most disadvantaged, those experiencing the most inequity in our community. And what we're learning about that in terms of utilising an Indigenous knowledge approach to caring for people inside of that process, but thinking generally about how we approach the complexity of our wicked problems. And so the thing I just wanted to raise is that I really like what Nadine was saying about shifting the paradigm on who knows best. And what we are saying in our approach to innovation is that we believe that our communities and our families know what's best for themselves in terms of what they need right now, but also in terms of prioritising their aspirations and their long-term outcomes. And so our job really has to be to think about what do we need to do to ensure that we fundamentally challenge the mindset around where the expertise, the experience, the creativity and the talent sits for grappling with our most complex issues. And so what that's meant for us is to think about how we triangulate epistemologies, particularly Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, within an innovation methodology which empowers our communities and our families to lead the design of their own local fit for purpose solutions, and what follows in terms of an enabling role as local government and hopefully as central government, what that means for us in terms of our role to enable that and the processes that are required for our communities to be recognised as the experts in their destiny, in their sovereignty, in their autonomy. And the kind of things that we think about using a cultural lens includes concepts of manaakitanga, nurturing and caring for people, aroha, genuinely sharing love with those that we seek to serve, mana, acknowledging the prestige of every person and their inherent value, and their inherent uniqueness as human beings. Rangatiratanga, their right to determine their own destiny. And those types of cultural concepts inside of these systems considerations around how do we reconfigure resource. That means we are sharing not just power, but resource and the ability to participate in these types of processes and enable these types of processes, and consider our role and our privilege as local government and central government in that.
Thank you very much, Angie. I want to come back to you with some more stories about your work and really get into the detail of that. But Penny, let me ask you, picking up what Angie just said, is government good at empowering communities and families to make decisions about their own lives, the decisions that matter to them?
I feel like that's almost a trick question, James. What I would say is that there's a growing appetite and understanding for what it means to try and do that, and an interest in wanting to make that happen. And as Nadine suggested, I think there are lots of different experiments and ways of trying to do things all around the world. The shift to how disability funding happens is a significant, it's an example of that. And there's, in most of the examples we can think of, there's also lots of challenges, right? But the intent, I think, is absolutely growing.
Just to interrupt you there, Penny, when you say the shift to disability funding, disability having charge of their own.
Correct. Yeah. So you have your own budget and you make the decision about what you need, and you apply that.
Yeah.
In the way that you want to. One of the things that I guess, just in terms of examples, what was really profound, I suppose, about the lockdown period for us was there was partnership and power sharing not by choice, if you like. It suddenly happened. So there was a whole lot of things that were that we might have been working towards, and the intention might have been to achieve, but actually we didn't have the right structures in place. But when community needed to, or also in the context of Aotearoa, iwi and marae, and so the different tribes and the different sub-tribes and community Māori groups within communities took up, they already exercised leadership, but they stepped into a space of responding very, very quickly and exercised leadership, and the government found itself in position of partnership instantaneously, if you like. And what happened in that case was that expertise that we've talked about. We want to recognise the expertise, and we want to share the resources. That expertise became legitimised, and so I think community found themselves, and iwi and different groups being asked questions for the first time that are great demonstrations of sharing power, like, is this working? What else do you need? Are we doing the right thing? And so I think now there's a lived experience of actually what power sharing looks like. Whether we can retain some of the structures and supports and infrastructures around that is a separate question. But I actually think the exemplars we've had of power sharing, which we sort of walked backwards into, if you like, over the last 3 months, are just an excellent lived expression of what it actually means and what autonomy means for different groups what it means to distribute power across communities to make decisions. So it happened by accident, if you like, but there's now an illustration of what it feels like and looks like tangibly to behave in a way that's power sharing. And I just, Nadine's examples really looked about participation and decision making at a kind of high level, which I think is really important. Our focus tends to be, we want to really support that too, but participation in terms of who makes the decisions about what's important and how we want to respond, because quite often what happens with government is we tend to centralise our responses around services and programs to the exclusion of other kinds of mechanisms and strengthening activities that can happen in community. So we're really interested in power sharing across place and in place through all activities of life, as opposed to just thinking about I'm participating in government, if you like. So just to add on to there. So.
Yeah, thanks, Penny. Nadine, I want to get you to pick this up in a moment, but can I just stay with you, Penny, for just a little longer on the disability issue. Jill Callister, who's a former senior public servant here and was on our panel last week, and she talked about the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia, and she said this was an example that was touted as giving a lot of power and initiative to people with disabilities. In fact, it's turned out to be quite human-centered reform, but actually it hasn't quite worked out that way. So the rhetoric has fallen, the reality has fallen well short of the reality, and that it mainly because of budget cuts. The intentions were lost in budget cuts. I just wonder if it's different in New Zealand. I think it would be worth tonight exploring the gap between the rhetoric that governments often put out about power sharing and the reality. And maybe the disability example is one we can look at first, Penny.
Yeah, and I mean, that's partly why I qualified it by saying, attempts and experiments, because certainly there's absolutely often really big vision and then significant issue in implementation. So we have lots of things where we might say this is how we would like the world to be, and someone says, oh, that's what X is supposed to be, but it's not. And so we do seem to be very much stuck in the loop of kind of knowing where we're trying to get to, but then not really nailing it actually when it happens. Some of the things that we've started to do is look at unpacking from the bottom up. And so we've got great intent, but we still keep wrapping things like what's the value of something, what's the criteria for something. Those still tend to be service driven, government set to serve some of the things that are genuinely important but consistently problematic, like how do we monitor something, how do we keep track of things. And oftentimes we might say, actually, this isn't the best measure, but it keeps it consistent with all the other times we've tracked it. So we're holding on to how we value success and criteria and how we choose what people can and can't do in things. Sometimes not based on anything to do with what's the best outcome for people, but around how we've sort of habitually decided to manage and track things like funding and hold responsibility around that. So I think once we start to unpack from the bottom and start moving up, we get a much better idea of what enabling government looks like to serve the things that happen on the ground. But we still keep quite often getting stuck in this motion. So place-based initiatives are very similar. The idea is that you're empowering at a local level, but quite often still when we draw the structure of place-based, it's still, despite best intentions, largely going down. There's not a lot of coming back up. So yeah, I think we really get stuck in still prescribing from a government lens and an idea of efficiency that doesn't actually match what outcomes, meaningful outcomes for families look like on the ground. So we kind of stop at referral or we stop at assessment, but we haven't gone, well, did that make the difference for people? Is that the thing that mattered to them? And we often find when we ask people what matters, it's nothing that would have been delivered by a service. So yeah, I'll pause it there just to leave room for more.
Nadine, what you need to, what do you think needs to be done to move for governments to move from fine words to reality here?
Well, I think I can from our listening tour around the world at the CPI, I can definitely relate to what both Angie and Penny were saying, because certainly when we spoke to people and ask them what it would mean for them to feel more connected to government and to feel like they really did have a meaningful role in shaping what comes next in their own lives. It was important that governments didn't just come to them and ask them questions on very specific, siloed, kind of departmental issues. People do want to talk about their lives as a whole. And it's very difficult if departments are approaching people issue by issue. And every room I walked into was an angry room of people that wanted to talk about systemic failures of government. And throughout the COVID crisis, government here in the UK has been trying to ask people, what do you need? When do you need it? But we need to build those spaces to create that solidarity, to address, yes, the immediate needs, but also the systemic issues that remain and are stubborn and are actually getting worse, such as the issues that we see arising around prejudice and racism. And now you walk into a room in any place in the UK, and you are now dealing with not just the aftermath of COVID, not just all the issues you were dealing with before, but now how are we going to talk to one another about a topic we've never spoken about before as a country, which is racism. And that, first of all, means that a government has to admit that there is a problem with racism. And you also have to admit that there is a problem with the way in which you share power when you talk about racism. So there is a huge amount of barriers to, even with all the great innovations that I talked about around deliberative democracy that are evolving around the world. And, you know, I have a paper out called Tackling Challenges Together, which I produced with Engage Britain, a really interesting new organisation that's trying to build conversations across the UK and experimenting with new methods in doing so. But we found wherever we looked in the world, those systemic issues were what people wanted to talk about. And when we spoke to the First Nations students in Canada about truth and reconciliation, they said there are 634 First Nations in Canada, yet they want us to come and talk as one. Government wants to still gloss over intersectionality. It still grapples with nuance. It still thinks that that racism has one source and is one problem affecting one group of people. And so we've got to create confidence within government. And create the know-how and allow people to speak their truth as well. And I'm afraid I am slightly pessimistic about attempts to create consensus around topics such as health and welfare and things like, if we don't get to those other very difficult systemic issues. And I think you have to have the both. And in all of the deliberative democracy examples that are in the paper Tackling Challenges Together I mentioned, none of them worked when they were just online. And the other thing about online is there are biases in there as well, and crowdsourcing itself has a ton of problems where you get a crowd mentality. So you really need to be careful about thinking that you can just approach people on one issue in one way. It's a complex area, but people are getting braver, and I am hopeful. I will remain positive.
Angie, how do you respond to what Nadine just said? Give us the context from where you see it, and I'm particularly interested in the people you work with in South Auckland, what their perceptions of government are and whether they feel heard by government.
I think it's fair to say in the community that I live in that we
and you tell us a bit about that community as well. Give us a bit of a picture of it. Who's there and what their position is.
Well, it's an amazing community of diversity and talented and creative people. We're a highly youthful population, a highly diverse population. We have a concentration of Indigenous and Pacifica people here, refugee and migrant people in my community. So I think comparatively, in terms of other communities in our country, we're highly diverse, highly youthful. We've got a whole heap of challenges at the same time. We are experiencing a high concentration of deprivation, of poor housing conditions, of poor educational outcomes and health outcomes at the same time. So, my job is to think about how we tackle the complexity Nadine was just talking about in a strength-based way. What I know to be true from the work that we're doing here with my community and our families here is that system responses, their binary nature of response means complexity will not be addressed through systems response solely, or we need to build the capability and the capacity for that to happen in terms of alternative systems responses, which we have been thinking about during COVID in terms of indigenising system response or helping system capability in terms of responses. I just want to say something about the stuff that sits at the heart of many of these symptomatic issues, and that is we think that in order for our communities and our whānau, for us to support wellness, that we need to acknowledge past, current and future in that. And so a whole heap of stuff that we're learning in terms of whānau, families and communities telling us what they need is centred on a healing process. And for many of our Indigenous people, that's intergenerational colonisation. And for many of our communities, it's intergenerational trauma. And so in order for us to grapple with the complexity that sits at the heart of our most wicked issues for our communities and to move forward to wellbeing, we're going to have to find a way of not shying away from the complexity but leaning into it. And that is at the heart of our work here in South Auckland. My work and Penny's work in the lab is to understand what do we need to be doing to be enabling a process where we can heal as a people on the land that we are, where we are, and in the place that we are. How do we help heal, and how do we not shy away from the complexity and the complicated nature of the lived realities of our families? And we think the way to do that is to empower our families to lead us in that process, not to participate in a service or an initiative or a process even, but to dictate the terms of engagement, to dictate the process, and to dictate what we value as outcome and output. So moving away from what we think as agencies we should be measuring and counting to what families and community are telling us most matter, and that to be strength-based and long-term. One of our biggest challenges at the moment is to hold now and future at the same time in systems response. For the most part, it's now, and I understand the requirement for that to meet needs, family needs as they identify them at the moment. The issue with that is it's very, very difficult to be aspirational, strength-based in that and long-term. And so it's locking us into a cycle of crisis. And really that's our challenge is to develop a way of engaging families that can hold all of that complexity simultaneously.
And thanks, Angie. And Penny, when you and Angie put those views to government, national government, how does national government, because national government is an important player here, isn't it, in terms of the services it delivers, how does it respond? And what do you see? I'm really struck by Angie's very strong, powerful comment about needing to dictate the terms. How does government respond when you talk like that to them?
I mean, we're trying to I guess I see us in partnership with central government and in partnership with communities. I think there's I hold multiple realities around this stuff and multiple truths. Sometimes we say, it's great that we've said we want to co-design something, but shall we take that out because actually we're not really? Like, how much are we willing to give up here? What's already been decided? Let's at least not pretend to be power sharing more than we really can. So in some cases, the conversation is about, let's be realistic about how much the conditions within particular parts of government at particular times are really ready for this kind of power sharing. So to some extent, it's just actually being honest about what we're capable of doing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be aspirational, but we also shouldn't, we need to be real about where we're at with our capabilities and the conditions that we're creating for power sharing, and focus on those, because we do tend to say things like we want to co-design this and co-design that, but we're not doing a lot of looking back always into ourselves and saying, have we created the conditions for that to be successful? So I think there's like I say, there's an appetite for building that capacity and that learning in. Some of it really, I think we've got to a point where we're really trying, I mean, there are efforts that I think should be absolutely applauded in central government, where there's real attempts to shift and commission differently, which is one of the most key places around power sharing, is, you know, how you decide how the money gets distributed and who gets it. In real terms, oftentimes we still decide how much power we want to share, which can't genuinely be power sharing, can it? So I do think that there is real significant attempts to restructure things like commissioning processes to create room and build capacity in different ways in community so that there can be power sharing. Because the other issue that we sometimes have is we swing the other way and we're like, oh, here, have some money, good luck. Community can do it. And then we're like, oh, it didn't work. Don't give them, we sort of oscillate between these different places. And so we're really interested in building the capacity for the in-between stuff, which we talk about relational practice a lot, which really is that thing about ongoing consistent partnership. You are in a reciprocal relationship, as opposed to, I've got a project and I'd like to talk to you about that right now. So really shifting into a more relational space, and that being about serving not just our needs, but understanding what it is that our partner requires from us and what resources we can bring. So in our setting as local government, and when we're tapped in to central government, huge amount of resource, how are we using that to support community partners as opposed to sort of drip feeding certain kinds of access? So I think, yeah, that we're at the stage always of trying to encourage the conditions internally, because we do a lot of looking out. But also I think it's really important that we are able, and I don't just mean us, I mean there's many people working on this, to demonstrate what alternatives look like. Because I think in some cases it's actually very hard to imagine what other than what we're doing now is. And so we're really also focused on supporting building capacity in community, but also working with community to say this is what different looks like. Because some of these things we don't have answers to. We really just need to try things and then say, actually, we've figured out what the business model looks like when money really is distributed in different ways, or we really are measuring from a different values base. But some of that really needs to be modelled and felt and implemented in practice before we can expect any real shifts, because we need something to shift to in some cases. So I think demonstrating compelling alternatives to some of our current structures is as integral as trying to, I guess, agitate.
Because in any community, that capacity building issue is critical, isn't it, Penny? I think people need to be supported to take on more power, and it's not enough just to say we're going to alter the power relations. We have to help people to actually have the capacity to take power, and I guess that goes to the question of empowerment, but also the question of getting the relationship right, Nadine, between expertise, which government has or claims to have, and the on-the-ground knowledge that communities have about their own situation. How would you balance those two forces?
So right now, at CPI, we've everything we thought we knew about listening, we've had to put to one side because of what's happened with COVID-19. It's really important that whatever book you're reading right now about it and whatever paper you've got in your hand, please don't assume that those things are absolutely right for now. We are doing a discovery phase with around 80 to 100 people in the north of England who've been really impacted by COVID-19, to ask them, how has listening changed for you? Where are you accessing your services? In fact, where are you? Some people have just completely gone off radar for days on end, who were originally accessing certain services, and that was how we knew they were okay. Now we don't know they're okay. So we have to go out to them. We have to go to where they are. We have to first find them. And then we have to ask them, how is life changing? How do you want to be listened to? And where are you at? And right now, that discovery phase is telling us really, really early findings that that people have found that they have developed these incredibly strong and rich relationships with maybe just one person that's providing a service, and they hold on to that for dear life. And there's absolutely no way that you can bring an expert in the room to then have that conversation. And we are trying to talk back to government, central government departments ourselves at CPI, to say you've got to let those relationships flourish and strengthen. And that is what has worked. If anything through COVID, that is what has worked, that ability for those relationships to develop wherever they need to be, and people having that freedom to go out there. So right now, that question about how do you balance it, I think right now it's a bit early. I think we just have to continue to allow the workers that really know people to get to know them even more, to stay in touch with them, to keep them alive when we were at that stage. And then we need to ensure that they feel comfortable accessing new types of services, therapy services, healing services, post-trauma services, art therapy, if you like, to help them to do so. So we're having to reimagine completely what support looks like in their place and in their situation. And I am on a journey, as we all are, of talking and educating central government about that. And I don't think in the UK that they are worried about that. I think that they're delighted about that. I think they just want to know how they can best support it. And we need to help create the feedback loops between people, those workers that are working with them, local government and voluntary sector need to join up better, and then back to central government. There's a whole load of feedback loops that need to be in place. So that's where we need to be, certainly in the roles that we're playing, is to help them to listen and help them to understand and create those rapid feedback loops all the time. And certainly I do agree, people are frightened at the front line that regulation, the old ways of thinking about commissioning and regulation and inspection, are going to come back any day now. And they're saying, please just give us some space. Let us decide what success looks like. In fact, who decides what success looks like is in itself a sharing power, a sharing of power. And people are keen, despite all of their trauma, as they were when I spoke to First Nations in Canada, despite all of their trauma, they really want to help. They really want to help you to help them. And there is a real appetite for that despite everything. So that's the positive that we take back to government, that even though you see rioting on the streets, even though you see hurt and anger all over the country, that is there. You need to create the spaces to discuss that, but also know people want to play a part in what comes next. And one final thing I want to say is, certainly in our country too, Angie and Penny, that search for truth and the need to have stories told about what has happened to people in their lives in this country, particularly for Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities. The need to tell stories and find truth and have that told to government is palpable here right now. And so I would say we've got a lot to learn perhaps from you and from other countries as we embark on that journey too.
Thanks, Nadine. There's heaps to go on with. Welcome back to the webinar. I hope you've all enjoyed the group chats. Terrific conversation in ours, and quite bracing actually. People talking about the challenges of place-based initiatives. That is the end game of that 6,000 different place-based programs. How does government manage that? How does it ensure equity and efficiency across the board? There are obviously big challenges there, and challenges raised by the COVID experience when governments are working flat out, and the default position is to say there's no time to chat, we've just got to do stuff, throw all this consultation out the window. But also on the upside, a potential to learn from the experience of communities in crisis. That they actually, in Australia, we've had terrible bushfires last summer, we've had floods, we're all now going through COVID, and people are actually learning quickly on the ground. And Angie, I might start with you, because when we spoke the other night, you actually saw some benefits out of the COVID time in your community, and I wonder if you might talk about that a bit.
Yes, I'd love to. Thanks, James. I just want to firstly put it in context that this is the experience of my community and in Aotearoa, which is in I feel a fairly privileged position at this stage when we think about how the world is having to respond on an ongoing basis to the pandemic. But one of the insights from our families here in my community have been that during lockdown, they've experienced more support, received more resource, and generally felt more had a feeling of abundance during lockdown than they did pre-COVID. And I think that's directly related to what you were just saying, James, about certainly for my community and the agencies working here, there was an urgency and a mandate to respond in a different way during lockdown. And so what that's enabled is a bunch of behaviours that have unlocked resource and support and enabled the distribution of that support and resource directly to families during the lockdown. And that's happened through mostly through community organisation or relationship, as Nadine was talking about, those that have the best relationships with our families and our communities. Often those aren't, I won't say often, I will say those can be through non-government organisations or Indigenous organisations who place relationship at the centre of what they do. So it's really interesting that for some families they are reporting an increase in the support and resource they received in lockdown. So our job has been to figure out really quickly how do we continue to enable those behaviours, because some of the insights for us at TSI and through the lab has been actually those behaviours are a matter of discretion and not necessarily of disruption. And so COVID is a pressure cooker to enable behaviours that governments and agencies may not have had previously, but they certainly may have had the discretion previously. And so we're trying to lean in to understand which of these behaviours are discretionary and which were disruptive, and how do we encourage an abundance mindset in the way that we continue to support families through agency and through system. But I just want to touch on something else based on what Nadine was saying just before we went to break, and I'm sure there were some amazing conversations in the breakout room. And that was, for some of our families, they soundly reject system, and that has been actually the best thing they could have done in lockdown and actually pre-lockdown too. And that system is often causing more stress for them in their lives than reducing or supporting them. And so it's really, really interesting to think about how we continue to enable a service response that is fit for purpose and values based and family and community focused, and support the ongoing innovation of the system based on what we know from our learnings through lockdown about what is now possible, because a whole heap of stuff that the system was telling us could not be achieved was achieved through COVID because of the urgency. And so how do we enable those?
I'll jump in there. What sort of things were achieved? Can you give us give us on the ground examples of what was achieved that would not have been otherwise achieved?
People waiting on social housing lists for 2 years housed in 2 hours. People queuing for food grants that may have been 5 hours in a waiting line, and then you wait 24 hours for that resource to be distributed to you, happening in 2 hours on a top-up card. So the response time was enabled by a whole group of agencies in our community who came together with the vision to be able to enable that sort of response during lockdown. And what we're leaning into is, was that a result of lockdown, or was that because the discretion was existing in the system but it wasn't being enabled? Like Penny was saying, what were the conditions? So while we want to lean into that, what I also wanted to speak to was the trust and relationship factor that Nadine was talking to, and what I want to, my provocation is that that doesn't need to be through government agency and local government agency, because what we observed was the ability for community to care for itself, and the leadership and the social capital that already exists in community, but we may not value as central and local government. And how do we start to reconfigure resources so that that can be enabled as well? Those that are most likely to be able to engage with our communities and our families that are most marginalised are the most under-resourced. So we need to think about how we reconfigure what we have to be able to enable those people who are working most closely and have the trust of families and communities.
Thanks very much, Angie. I'm going to throw to you, Nadine, picking up what Angie just said. And I'm going to ask everybody to speak quite briefly, and we've only got 8 minutes left, and I want to get back to Penny. Nadine, can I ask you, who empowers people within government to share power? That's a question that's come up from Estelle in the chat. You know, we all say government needs to share power, but how do you kickstart a process where people in government might actually be empowered themselves to share power? And perhaps there's even a previous question there. Is it government that's the blocker here, do you think?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. There is absolutely a need to want to feel that, even that's back to that sense of belonging. If you work in a government department, you also need to feel like you belong there too. And it takes a brave person to sit at a table and say, what are you doing? Why are you here? But actually, I have found, having worked, well over a decade in Whitehall in my past, that actually what ministers really want is that challenge. And certainly today, we're being asked at CPI to provide that challenge. So sometimes it's a timing thing. So, for example, right now, government is absolutely realising that it's going to need to reimagine how it's going to renew and rebuild the UK. We're in a fight stage still. Government can still feel quite top down, but we're really fighting hard to transition into a letting go phase, a place where we can heal, where we can start to recover. And you can feel that tension playing out at the top table all the time. They know that they're there, they just don't know how to get there. So I think it is about finding the right time to say it. And all of us as leaders who work in government, say it now, because this is the time. And there are definitely real, you can say it with hope, not with criticism. No one needs to feel bad about this. It's just that we've got to move forward now more positively with people. And so I think there's a timing issue. There's a bravery that's needed to speak truth to power. Hopefully you've got some great ministers you need to tie yourself closely to, and some brilliant senior permanent secretaries and DGs who are scratching around, trying to find allies and solutions and need your help. And we are absolutely there for them. So I think there's a timing issue about that. But there's a culture, isn't there, in the civil service and across government? This is about culture change, fundamentally. They do say culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think it absolutely does. And I think there is a new generation of people that are growing up in government now. And I'm I was so inspired to see the new fast streamers that have come into Whitehall in the UK, and their determination to fight all of those systemic issues and to educate themselves and to speak truth to power. So I'm very hopeful that there will be a culture change if we don't let systems eat up that enthusiasm and that energy, and we grow it and we love it and we show them kindness in their jobs. Certainly social workers, for example, going right out now to more of the front line. At CPI, we asked them to think about how they could reimagine services for children, social care, and given the freedom to think for 5 minutes, just have some space, they came up with a system for social care and social working that would be accountable, more accountable, so you could reassure ministers of that, and would free up 50% of their time to spend with families. So if we could just have a moment and have more of those stories, being fed back into central government, I think central government will have the confidence to act. But at the moment, that's exactly what they need. And I think we can provide it if they can just open the door and we can be brave enough. But now is the absolute time to do it. We didn't do it after Grenfell Tower, the disaster we had here. And I do want to just pick up on something that Angie said, which is, and then my final point, one thing we didn't do with Grenfell is we didn't treat it as a humanitarian disaster. That's why we couldn't get food out to people. That's why we didn't get people housed and sheltered quickly. This time, I think we've learned a bit from that, and we have. And that emergency response
Nadine,
that we've taken is what we need to do. Sorry, Grenfell was a tower block of housing in London, in Kensington, one of the richest boroughs of London, Kensington and Chelsea, that burnt to the floor, killing dozens of people, mainly people who don't have much in life, who have fought their way through to even get that flat that they lived in, and that tower block burnt to the floor because it didn't have the right protection and cladding in place. And the recovery effort is still going on for that, and that was a long time ago now. So, but I think what we've done, we're learning from that. This is still, if we could still keep that kind of almost that collaboration mentality of a humanitarian disaster a little bit longer, and just give people the space to think, I can say back to central government, they have got the answers. They can solve those accountability problems. There's 600 conversations that you're worrying about, and there's ways that you can gather that and scale that up.
I'm going to stop you now, Nadine.
So, yeah.
No, it's okay. We're running out of time, and
Thank you very much.
No, not at all. I really want to hear from Penny to wind us up tonight. Penny, I'd like you to reflect on, pretty inspiring and optimistic statement from Nadine. Can we take the lessons of crisis forward when hopefully the crisis abates? And also, this is coming up in the chat quite a bit, how do we measure the impact of maintaining and nurturing relationships with stakeholders? How do you measure that in a way that's going to be meaningful to government and to funders, et cetera, so that we can actually build a kind of culture around these things in future?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely lots of commitment from right across different parts of government to retain the way of working and the values-based common purpose that drew people together. And the shutters have come down or gone up, depending on my bad metaphor. People are much more open to the idea of working in collaboration. So my strength, your strength equals these other things. In terms of how do we measure, what we're working on is, I think we've done a really great job of our high level wellbeing indicators. I think actually we understand what good looks like at a high level. Usually our high level wellbeing indicators are great protective factors. They're about identity, they're about social connection. They're the things that genuinely matter to people. Our gap is what we're measuring at the implementation, because they're not the same things. So we're not looking at how well do our community facilities support social connectedness. We're getting stuck on the transactional numbers, or whether or not people joined, or did they attend a program or not. But so that we've created a gap between our vision of the indicators that we know that matter, and then what we're doing on the ground to measure those. So I actually think we kind of understand how to track and what to pay attention to, but we haven't. What we haven't figured out is how to hold to those things at the implementation level. So it's fairly straightforward to establish with people whether or not they feel like they've been supported to connect with other people or not. It's actually not that hard to do. It's just not how we're boxing up our funding and our resources and configuring things at the moment on the ground.
Thanks, Penny. That poses a really concrete challenge for all of us going ahead from here. I want to thank Angie Tangeere, Penny Hagan and Nadine Smith for terrific contributions from all of you. Thank you again for coming this evening, and please join us at our next webinar.